The smell inside the cathedral was rank, but Francois knew that it could have been much worse. He had hidden here for a week, tucked away in the upper levels where thin corridors allowed workers access to the floors that had yet to be fully built, and which would later accommodate the clergy who would be housed here. As long as he ensured he cleaned out the dead pigeons, he had been able to gather clean water to drink from the rain gutters, but had only a meager supply of food that was dwindling every day. Had he been alone, he would have tried to stay here longer, allowing the slow erosion of sanity all around him to continue its implacable progress. But he wasn't alone. He looked across at the small child, tucked away in a corner and wrapped in discarded priest's vestments. The boy was asleep, but would awaken soon. Francois had no choice. He would feed his son the last of their food and then get them out of the city. It was their only real chance of safety, unless he planned to keep them here to starve to death. He had already sat here for too long. The child was tired and hungry, growing gaunt from surviving on meager rations and rainwater. Francois stared through the small window in the room he had chosen as their hiding place, across the open expanse of the cavernous cathedral and into the eyes of Jesus Christ, rendered with almost aching beauty in cold, hard marble beyond. At the feet of the statue had been a slaughter. People had made their way to the cathedral when the city walls were breached, running inside and saying desperate prayers, beseeching divine intervention, anything that would save them. Their solicitations, frantic and hurried, had turned to screams as the creatures found them, drawn to the building by the fearful stink of so much flesh. The demons had smashed against the doors, but the wood and metal held firm. Francois had built those doors himself, and they had not failed, despite the hellacious pressure as the vile creatures on the other side pounded on them. The rancid vileness of them had built up against the stone and wood like a tide, climbing the outer walls until eventually it reached the windows. They had thought that the thick stone, 20 feet high, had been enough, and only at that point did the stained glass windows begin, depicting scenes of the armies of man, guided by the Lord, taking on hordes of hell. What a mockery that had turned out to be. The creatures merely climbed atop each other, little care for the bodies beneath them, happy to dash their demented comrades to pieces if it granted them one more inch of height. When they reached the glass, they smashed it easily and tumbled inside, landing on the floor with sickening wet cracks, breaking bones against the rich marble of the floor. Francois had huddled with his son in the tiny room where the priest in charge of the construction work had slept, the door barred against anything that might have made its way up there. He had run there when the news first broke of the enemy forces arriving at the walls. He couldn't think of anywhere else to go. And so he had sat in the same corner his son now slept in, the child against his chest, hands over the young boy's ears to drown out the screams. He had no way to protect himself from those wails, the awful, disgusting cries, and the savage tearing of flesh and splintering of bone. When the creatures came through the windows, the panic had been like a wildfire, stripping people of their senses. They had lifted the bars on the doors, imagining in their terror that they could run outside and fend for themselves. Instead, the doors had exploded inward, a tide of flesh and teeth and tearing claws, and it had washed over them with the fury of the devil himself. The disgusting and disturbing sounds had lasted for hours, and eventually, their evil work done, the sickening mob of infected creatures had wandered out into the cold night in search of more survivors. By that point, the entire city seemed to have been reduced to a hellscape, and Francois could hear screams and cries coming from the different districts throughout the night. The docks had caught fire, and it quickly spread through all the warehouses, tanneries, and chemical storage until an explosion had torn through the Maker's Quarter, spreading fire across the rest of the city. Francois couldn't see the damage from his side of the cathedral, but he could see where the fire had spread before heavy rains a few days before had managed to put it out. If not for that, the entire city may have burned down. It let him know that heading to the docks was pointless. Any ship or boat that had still been there at that point would have been destroyed, and even if it hadn't, it would be a miracle if the lock gates were open to allow him out. No, it was the eastern gate. That had been where the enemy had breached, and they would have continued their march through the city and were likely either on the western side at this point or gone completely. Their mindless beasts were not here to occupy, only to destroy, or so he had hoped. He had waited for nightfall, convinced that moving through darkness would be better. He knew many of the back lanes and alleys in the city and was firm in his belief that he could make it out if he just stayed out of view of any street creatures that roamed the streets. The cries of the demons and monsters had been growing quieter for the last 3 nights as the army filtered out of the city, slowly drawn to the main horde like a swarm of drunken ants. He picked up his son and sat at the small table, cradling the baby in his arms. At just under 1.5 years old, the child had been a miracle. He and his wife had already had their family, 2 sons and 2 daughters, all grown up and gone to make their way in the world. They had been, they thought, too old to have another, yet God had gifted them with one. His wife had been so happy. Somehow the pregnancy seemed to make her young again, filled with energy. The thought of raising another child, shaping another young mind, had filled her with youthful vigor. But the pregnancy had been hard, and she was often sick. The midwives and other women had advised them that she was just too old, but his wife would have none of it. When a friend advised that she take the whore's draught, she had risen from her bed in a fury and thrown her from the house. The child was sent by the Lord, she had shouted, and that had been that. It tore at his heart to think of her screams during the birth, the blood and the pain of it, but after delivering the baby, the other women had left the room, leaving them alone to their last moments. "Francois," she had said, weak and tired, her eyes barely open, "you must protect our little boy for me, for I have given all of myself to him. He is God's child, God's little lion." She had closed her eyes and breathed her last, and Francois had sat beside her, holding their child as tears streamed down his cheeks. He had mostly distracted himself from the loneliness over the last year with his work at the Cathedral and his duties as a father, but the pain of loss still burned within him. He couldn't allow anything to happen to Leon. He could not break his promise. He took some water from the small skin he had filled with rain and poured some out onto the bread. His boy already had good teeth and loved to chew on the soft figs and grapes from the vineyards, but the bread was hard and stale after so many days, and he needed to soften it for the child. He slowly and carefully fed his son, pushing all thoughts of the world around them away, feasting on this one last moment of normality, closing his eyes and straining to feel the soft presence of his wife. But all too soon the moment was over, the food gone, and it was time to venture out into the hell that had once been home. He wrapped the child back in the vestments, tearing them and tying them around himself like a harness. He needed his hands free and to be able to run. It stung his heart to think, but to get his son to safety, he needed to be free of the burden of him. Finally, he grabbed 2 of his sharpest chisels and a hammer. Hardly worthy weapons, but it was all that he had. Finally ready, he didn't waste time looking around the room that had kept him safe for the last week. He imagined he would never see it again, and longed to leave the ghostly echoes and screams behind him. He slowly made his way down the stone steps, making sure not to make a noise, and pushed out the wooden door at the bottom. It stuck for a moment before giving away with a quiet scraping noise, and he realized that he was pushing some forgotten bones and shattered teeth as he opened it. The smell was so much worse now, and he was glad that in the dim light of the falling night, he couldn't see the details of what had happened here. He quickly crossed the cathedral, heading for the open main door, but halfway there, between the pews and exposed to the world, he stopped, heart hammering in his chest. In the inky black at the back of the cathedral, the part that had been hardest for him to see from his perch high in the rafters, A shape was waiting. "I thought that there was someone here," it uttered, the words falling from its mouth as if they were made of decay. "I could smell you. At first, I thought to only wait a while, but then it became a game. How long could I stay before God would strike me down?" The creature almost spat the Lord's name, and it seemed to hurt him to say it. Slowly it stood, a sickly and wizened shape unfolding itself from the shadows. It stretched its arms out, and they seemed far too long, bound in flowing robes. Francois went to turn and run, but the creature screamed a command, "Stop!" and he couldn't help himself. His fear transfixed him, pinning him to the spot like a butterfly on a mounting board. As the foul creature came closer to him, he inched his hand slowly toward the chisel in his belt, but he couldn't take his eyes from the slowly revealing horror before him. The monstrous being was tall, maybe 12 feet or so, and what he had thought were robes were actually flaps of skin, hanging like delicate silks, as if the beast had been gorging and rotund, then suddenly stricken with a wasting fever. Its head was bald, its eyes milky and sickly, and sores and welts oozed all along its saggy skin. Its mouth was too big, almost like a hinge, and when it spoke its tongue fell forth and lolled around, distorting its words. "He never thought of you while you hid up there. He never thought to strike me down. But I thought of you, your beautiful fear, and your anguish. I anticipated you." Francois wanted to scream or vomit or plunge his chisel into the thing's eyes, but he could not force his hand to move further. He could not overcome the terrible fear that had him firmly in its grasp. He could only watch as the creature slowly extended a hand, close enough to almost touch him, and pointed to the bundle on his chest. "I anticipated that." It took one more step forward, the hand gently brushing against the bundle, and Leon started to cry. His wails cut through the quiet darkness of the night, echoing off the walls of the cathedral, and Francois was finally able to move, spurred on by his son's fear and anguish. He scurried backward, both hands coming out with chisels, backing toward the altar, but the creature was unearthly quick, and it barreled into him, sending his makeshift weapons flying and knocking him to the ground. He slid backward along the marble floor, the thin, brittle decay of the dried blood turning to dust beneath him. The creature stood over him and laughed, a horrible mocking sound, taking glee in his terror. "You are so afraid to die. You would run if you had the strength, or fight if you had the courage, but you have nothing except that child." Leon continued to cry from beneath the torn vestments, and Francois could only hope the boy had not been injured when the creature had crashed into him. "I will make you a deal, a simple matter of exchange. Give to me the child," the creature giggled. "Let me eat him, bones and all, and I will let you go free." For the first time, Francois managed to speak, the words tumbling forth as he managed to get himself to his feet again, standing before the creature. "Are you insane? This is my child. I would sooner die than give him up." "Oh, but die you will, and die you shall. I'll spread your guts across the floor, and you can watch me eat the boy as your blood and shit mix together on the marble. But give him unto me. Place him in my hands, and I will eat only him. And you can go. I feel the fear inside you. It rages like a storm. You do not want to die here." Voice trembling, Francois searched for words to say, to potentially reason with this creature, but he knew that it was pointless. There was nothing to be said that would spare him. "Whatever you are to do, you will do, demon," Francois uttered, his voice trembling. "God will protect me, either here or in the afterlife. I shall not deny him with so heinous a crime. I shall not give up my own son to filth like you." With that, the creature flew into a terrible rage, throwing his hands towards the vaulted ceiling and screaming. It grabbed pews and flung them across the cathedral, raging left and right, turning wood to splinters beneath it. Francois recoiled, unable to tell from the terrible wails if the thing was laughing or crying, watching as it formed a trail of destruction through the pews that he had spent so many years making. Suddenly it darted towards him, lightning fast, grabbing his arm and wrenching it towards his mouth. Those terrible, rotten teeth bit down, and the pain burned through him. Instantly, blood began to flow in thick rivulets, dripping on the floor, splashing on the once blessed fabric that was wrapped around his son. Just as quickly, the thing let go, dancing backwards with a terrible grace. The creature drew itself up to its full height and screamed, its words echoing off the walls and out into the flickering lights of the still burning city. "I will eat you alive. I will slowly chew the flesh from your bones, and you will know only agony. You will beg for death, but I will deny you even that mercy. I'll chew you up and you'll live forever inside me, a writhing mass of pain and sorrow." The thing was manic now, spitting and sobbing as it screamed. Francois held his arm, the flesh still burning as if the demon's teeth were still piercing him. His blood oozed slowly from between his fingers, and he glanced around frantically, desperate for anything that might offer respite from this insane demon that tormented him. His eyes fell upon the holy water font, and in it he saw his salvation. He dashed toward it, hoping the ravings of the beast meant that it was not paying attention to him. He moved as fast as he ever had in his life, spurred on by fear and hope. He got close enough to see the still glistening water at the bottom of the font. It was a miracle that there was any left at all, or that it had not been upended in the slaughter. His fingers were inches away from the water when he felt monstrous pressure as the thing grabbed him by the shoulder, hurling him into the massive marble altar at the other side of the room. He smashed into it, feeling ribs break, somehow managing to wrap his arms around his son, so fragile and so delicate. He felt his head crash into the tiles as he fell to the floor, and for a moment everything was darkness. Then the dull aching of his ribs, shoulder and head called to him, and as he cleared his vision and came to his senses, his injuries became a loud choir of voices all vying for his attention. He had no time to wonder at the seriousness of them, or the safety of his son, for the creature had him by the throat, pulling him to his feet and pushing him back against the altar. He could feel its terrifying grip and the tremendous power of it, the dry, rough texture of its hands where the skin was mottled and brittle. It moved its face mere inches from his, and were it not for the terrible pressure of the hand around his throat, he feared he would have vomited from the smell. "Give the boy to me. This is your final chance." Francois knew that he could not save his son, and that he was damning them both to an agonizing death, but there was nothing in him that would agree to give up his boy, his little lion. The child was all he had in the world, and he could not deny his wife's last wish. He could not save him, but he also would not betray him. He would not be steered from God's light and the path of the righteous, no matter the vile threats and punishment dished out by this unclean creature. No. He managed to force the words out around the titanic pressure the demon was putting on his throat, and for a moment he thought the thing would simply snap his neck and end his pain there and then. Instead, as if it were a puppet whose strings had been cut, the thing released its grip and collapsed upon the cold marble of the floor before the altar. It buried its face in the folds of its own flesh, as if it sought to hide its pain, and it cried. Francois had never heard such anguish before, as if the entirety of the demon's world was crumbling down around it. He lay on the ground beside the heaving beast, arms around his son, feeling the fretful cries as they left his child and mingled with the deep, mournful dirge coming from the creature. Francois didn't know what to do, so he did nothing, just lying there, desperate for one last moment of life, perhaps one last chance to survive this cursed day. After a while, he slowly and painfully got to his feet, different private agonies exploding in his leg, shoulder, and ribs. His head contained a dull thumping of pain, and he could feel his own heartbeat as a drum within his chest. His arm still oozed blood, and his mouth tasted of sharp copper. He drew a deep breath and spat, and heard a pair of teeth clatter as they struck the floor. At his feet, the creature cried, but he could make out words among the sobs now. It seemed in an instant it had gone from a fearsome and terrifying harbinger of death to a pathetic and broken thing. Francois cared not for the cause of this change, only that it gave him an opportunity to leave. As he started to walk painfully away, he felt the creature grab him by the leg, almost gentle now, raising its face to him, seeming to turn away from the statue of Christ at the head of the church, as if suddenly his holy countenance inflicted pain on it. As I waited for you, God did not strike me down, but I heard his voice in my mind. He taunted me, and a bet was made. I was certain that I could break you, that I could turn you away from him. The creature let out one final rattling sob and seemed to deflate, the last of whatever resilience it felt, leaving it like a racking cough. I failed. God knew your strength, and now I am doomed. I care not for your fate, creature. I merely wish to be gone from here with my son. Release my legs so that I might be on my way. Francois tried to make his voice sound authoritative, channeling the spirit of Father Dubois, who had overseen the construction of the cathedral, but whose blood was now mingled with his and so many others across the floor. As I lost the bet with your lord, I must see you safely from the city. That was one small part of the price of my failures. Francois was taken aback. It seemed impossible, but everything about the demon had changed. It no longer railed and terrified him, and was instead the most pathetic creature he had ever seen. Was this, in fact, the miracle that he had prayed for over those 7 nights as he hid upstairs with Leon? He had prayed endlessly, begging God to deliver him mercy, to save him and his son. It was too much, and he could feel the edges of his mind begin to crack, a swirling vortex rising inside him as his emotions raged. He could feel a darkness creeping in at the edge of his vision as his heart hammered in his chest, and his mouth once again filled with a metallic taste. His limbs felt weak, although he couldn't tell if that was from the damage inflicted by the demon or something else. Had this all been a test? He looked down at the boy wrapped in his arms, remembering the final words of his wife. God's child. God's little lion. He forced himself to take long, slow breaths, trying to clear his mind. Nothing had changed. He had to get his son out of the city. He had already survived the impossible. The idea of making it through the city now with his injuries, somehow unhindered by any remaining filth and monstrosities that prowled its dark alleys, felt like too much to ask. He could feel his son moving in the cloth that still held him close to his chest. The boy had stopped crying, and Francois raised his hand to rub his head, absent-mindedly playing with the fine hair that covered it. The ache in his chest grew, sharp and distracting, the lingering damage inflicted surely by his broken ribs. He knew he couldn't linger any longer or he would lose the strength to push through. He had little choice. The demon could have killed him at any time. Why was this so different from the ones that had fallen upon the cathedral and devoured the townsfolk so readily? There was little other explanation for its behaviour, for its newfound fear and sense of defeat. Francois walked slowly to where his chisels had landed on the floor, picking them up and returning them to his belt. They were no more effective than they had been when he first drew them, but having them offered some small sense of comfort. He turned to where the beast was curled up on the floor, pointing at it. Fine. You will lead us safely from this city, but keep your distance. I do not want your filth near my son. The creature said nothing, merely stood, head bowed, still desperate not to meet the eyes of the marble statue that rose up into the top of the cathedral. Francois let the beast get about 30 paces ahead of him, then followed him out of the shattered main doors and away from the house of worship that had been reduced to little more than a charnel house. All around them, the city was mostly silent. It seemed that almost all the populace had succumbed to the attack, and anyone who managed to survive was not about to give away any sign of their presence. Maybe they had died where they hid, or had enough food to last yet more days and nights. Whatever the reason, it was only Francois and little Leon who had been forced from their bolt hole. They were the only humans to walk the streets. Francois wished to close his eyes against the destruction all around him. The city he had lived in his entire life was in ruins. Where doors and windows had not been shattered, or entire walls sundered, fire had torn through it, reducing so much of it to ash. The rank smell of smoke still hung in the air. Houses that he knew, owned by lifelong friends, were reduced to piles of rubble. The ones that had survived were empty and foreboding. Doors and windows dark, no smoke coming from chimneys with the promise of a warm fire, rich wine, and easy conversation. The creature, for his part, said little. He would ramble at times or break into fitful sobs, but mostly he seemed to do as he had promised, glancing around them. Twice they had run into other beasts, shambling creatures that looked almost human, but rotten from top to toe, missing lumps of flesh, and they had too many mouths, yet somehow still upright and wandering the streets in search of food. The first had turned and left at a spoken command from the creature in a language that Francois could not comprehend, but the second had lunged at them from an alley, making it dangerously close before the tall demon was upon it. He lifted it easily, tearing it in two and throwing the torso and legs away like refuse. Both pieces thrashed on the ground where they landed, and Francois had somehow managed to quicken his pace, despite the terrible pains in his body. He couldn't think about that now, or the lack of food. He just needed to get out of the city. There were several small towns and villages nearby that he could make for that would surely have food and a doctor. Mostly, they walked in silence, and Francois was too caught up in his own thoughts, too tired from his ordeal, and suffering from what must be a massive injury to his chest, to notice the slow change in the demeanor of the demon. As they got close to the gates, he slowly drifted closer to the pair, casting glances at the bundle that Francois held so close, like the most precious of cargo. They were almost at the gates when Francois felt a new bolt of pain, a stinging in his chest as the adrenaline from the nightmare he was enduring began to wear off. His leg was pure agony now, his breath shallow from the burning ribs, but through it all cut a sharp and gnawing feeling. He tried to move his son to better examine any wound or injury he had sustained to his chest, but the child was held fast, and the pain only got worse. And as the cloth that had wrapped his son fell away, he saw why. Leon, his little lion, skin mottled and discoloured, had latched onto his flesh, new and horribly disfigured teeth growing within his mouth. His little ribs no longer rose and fell, and his eyes were a sickly milky white. Something inside Francois cracked, and the terror and the horror of the last few hours, the terrible sights and sounds of the last week, all of them endured in the hope that he would save his son. He felt himself shatter and fell to his knees, his eyes weeping silent tears as his son's teeth found purchase upon a new portion of his flesh. Beside him, the demon smiled, a slow grin turning eventually into a hideous laugh, as if all this was the perfect merriment. People are such fools, it thought. The man had really seemed to think that God had saved him, had interceded on his behalf. It laughed and cavorted through the streets, arms flailing around it in a demented dance, billowing folds of flesh fluttering through the air. The demon had smelled the rot in the child before they had ever descended the stairs. The boy was always destined to die. It had simply wished to torment the man. The demon understood what few of its fellows were capable of comprehending, that it was torment and anguish and sorrow that made the flesh taste best. It was worth fighting the pangs of hunger if the end result was a feast. To eat the surrendered child in front of him would have been a delight, made even better by the betrayal of falling upon him after. But this was a poetry that the demon itself could barely have conceived. The man was now destroyed in a way that even the demon had rarely seen, the very fabric of his being torn asunder from overcoming such pain and torment. And all for nothing. He crouched in the middle of the street and watched the child chew for a time, staring into the eyes of the man but seeing nothing there but a distant silent screaming. Eventually, able to fight his own hunger no more, he fell upon them, and neither child nor man uttered a sound as the demon's teeth and claws carved through them.